Hi, I'm Pastor Dennis Plant. I'm the principal of Vision Colleges, the very best Bible college on or off the internet. But as I keep saying, you don't need to take my word for it. Go for yourself to have a look. visionbiblecollege.edu.au. There you're going to find the most flexible, affordable set of Bible college studies that are tailored to meet your need. But right now, what I really want to do is take a little time and continue with the series that we've been starting on the world's greatest story. This is the first 500 years of the church's history, and then there's just a few short chapters on the next 500 years. Why, why check out church history? Why even have a look at it? Well, someone once wisely said that he who refuses to take note of history is doomed to repeat it. And as we look at church history and we see that down through the centuries, people have not taken a great deal of notice and care over this particular issue. Indeed, the problems have been repeated. Well, that's one side. The other side of it, though, in particular, as we're looking at persecutions, is to have a look at the foundation upon which our faith has been based. We have an incredible and unique heritage, and we need to know what it is. We need to be able to honor it. We need to be able to build on what those have done before us so that indeed we can understand what our faith is all about. So we're going to begin today's session on the true great periods of persecution. Now, this is really, really important. I need you to get hold of this book, The World's Greatest Story. You can get it on visionbiblecollege.edu.au. You can get it, and you need to get it because really I can only just give you virtually a glossary of the information that is available through this incredibly informative and helpful set of studies on the early church history. So I want to encourage you, get hold of the material, get hold of it, and particularly have a look at the two great periods of persecution. And we need to understand what that persecution is really all about. The introduction for this, Christians courageous. We need to realize something, and that is that the early saints were indeed incredibly gracious people. They were people that really believed their faith in a measure that we really do not see in the Western world today. Yet our faith is built on the blood of the same martyrs. We need to understand that persecution was very real, but it was also very largely understood. There is an expression that we need to consider for a moment. That expression is that times go by turns. And that is to say that the churches, and like everything else, there is this cyclical effect of time. And the church has seen persecution to prosperity and back again down through the centuries. So in this particular chapter, we're going to explore the changing fortunes of the church and its relations with imperial Rome. After all, it was imperial Rome that was responsible for much of that early persecution, although not all of it. One thing to realize, though, is that the persecution of the church saw, depending on how you look at it, it saw two particularly powerful periods. One was the local and spasmodic, and the other was the global application, which is the empire-wide persecution of the church. So it's not simply and easily laid out. The persecution of the church in the first periods of persecution were not quite as severe as so many times they're made out to be. Now, please understand, I do not mean that to say that the early persecution of the church, particularly from 640 to 250 AD, I don't wish to imply that it was not severe. Far from that. I want us to understand there was genuine persecution, but we need to understand that in that genuine persecution, It was different in the earliest days. In fact, from 64 through to 250 BC, the persecution of the church was generally local and spasmodic. It came about mostly through neighbourhood jealousies and fears and local conflict. Local authorities, rather than the imperial government, were the instigators of much of the early persecution of the church. Those who were victims of the persecutors' violence, they really did find it terrible. But the loss of life was comparatively small in those first 200 years, and it had very little impact on the church. Now, this does not minimize persecution itself. Please understand that. Indeed, the persecution was very real. It's highlighted by remembering that across the first 3 centuries of this era, some 54 emperors ruled. Scarcely more than a dozen of them actively intervened in the idea of doing some harm to the church. Indeed, on several occasions, the imperial governments actually intervened to stop or to minimize and to lessen the sufferings of the local church. In fact, there's a couple of evidences that we can find in history from Trajan in 112 AD and from Hadrian in 124. And here's something which I believe we've shared before. Pliny has written to the Emperor Trajan, "You have the right, my dear Pliny, in examining the cases of those denounced to you as Christians. My rule is that they are not to be sought out. If they are informed against and the charge is proved, then of course they must be punished, but with this reservation. If anyone denies he is a Christian and actually proves it, that is, by worshipping other gods, he shall be pardoned as a result of his recantation, however suspect he may have been with respect to the past." So there was a problem was beginning to happen in the world, and that is that the growth of the church was considerable. It was growing and growing, and the problem was that the local community really admired more than despised the local Christians. In fact, Origen in 240 AD makes a statement that helps us to understand that for a while, persecution, while real and horrible, was not a major issue as we tend to think it to be. This is what Origen wrote. But with regard to the Christians, because they were taught not to avenge themselves upon their enemies, and thus they have observed laws of a mild and philanthropic nature, and because they would not, although able, have made war even if they had received authority to do so, they have obtained this reward from God, and he has always warred on their behalf, and on certain occasions has restrained those who rose up against them and desired to destroy them. For if, in order to remind others that after seeing a few engaged in a struggle for their religion, they might also be better fitted to despise death, some on special occasions, and those individuals can be easily numbered, have endured death for the sake of Christianity. Now note that expression, that they can easily be numbered. God not permitting the whole nation to be exterminated, but desiring that it should continue and the whole world should be filled with this salutary and religious doctrine. Well, indeed, it's been said that more people have died for Christ in the latter half of our 20th century than were martyred in the first 300 years. According to one authority, in the year 1990 alone, at least 250,000 people perished because they were Christians. That violence has not ceased, and there are still many parts of the world where men and women who openly confess Christ place their lives in jeopardy. Of course, we also have to take into account the fact that the population has grown significantly from a few million to now 8 billion people. So yes, the numbers of the persecuted will indeed grow and they will indeed multiply. That does not diminish what happened. Please don't consider that I would even say so. Church leaders were very wise in those days. They prevented a lot of harm by discouraging the urge for martyrdom wherever possible. People at risk of persecution were encouraged to flee, to return to their homes only after the fury had abated. Those who deliberately sought martyrdom were rebuked strongly. Tens of thousands heeded the advice of their pastors. They escaped before they could be arrested. Many of them lost all their possessions, all but their lives, and the lives of their family were preserved. Their witness for Christ was able to continue. Well, whilst all of that is true, we have to understand something, and that is that there was a second and a more terrible persecution, and that one was the universal and continuous persecution from AD 250 to AD 234. There were during this time three particular emperors that had a great deal of influence in the early church, and one of those was Decius. His persecution was from 251 to 260 AD. There is an easy tendency to say, well, persecution was simply on the basis of Christianity, on the basis of faith. Well, that has a very large part to do with the whole thing. Of course it does. But we need to understand what the motivation was behind the Roman governments to cause and to bring about this most dreadful set of persecution that the church had to face. In the year 249, the Emperor Decius, faced with the disintegration of the empire, decided he had to bring the empire together. Somehow he had to bring it back together and to restore its virtues and its religion. His hope was to restore the empire to the glory it had under Augustus. Well, he decided the best way to achieve this goal was to require that all the subject peoples were to emulate their own localities the great religious sacrifice that he would offer to the emperor's guardian deities in Rome. Well, what was that? No one was required to abandon their personal religion. In fact, amazingly, when you look at the Roman system, their governments, and that their religion, and indeed it was a religion, the Roman lifestyle, religion was really a cult. But they were incredibly compassionate towards other religions. They believed that it was right for everyone to be able to worship their own gods, but what they must do is incorporate the worship of Caesar amongst their gods. That worship of Caesar is really tongue-in-cheek. They were never required to actually worship him as do Christians worship Jesus today, or even back in those days. Indeed, it was more of a lip service. It was a matter of honouring Caesar, of giving respect to him, because in him resided the majesty and the power of the gods. So what was required of people was that they should burn a smidgen of incense, and they should recite the expression that Caesar was Lord. And in return for this, they were given a particular document, and that was called a libellus. I have a copy of that here. Here's a libellus, and there's a link there, so you can copy that and go to have a look at it. But the libellus was a papyrus, and this one is from Philadelphia. It features a fully prescribed libellus, a certificate attesting the completion of a sacrifice to the gods, dated 250 AD. The text contains 22 lines in Greek, written on just one side of the papyrus. A duplicate of the same libellus is preserved in the papyrus collection in Hamburg. So what happened was that you would burn this pinch of incense, make a declaration before a Roman uh, official that Caesar is Lord, he in turn would give you this libellus or this document. That particular document you needed to keep with you because you would be challenged by Roman soldiers and various other government officials. And if you did not have the libellus, then you were considered an enemy of state. Now, the problem faced by the early church was this statement, Caesar is Lord. Burning the incense wasn't an issue. It was this statement, Caesar is Lord. Because to say that in the minds of the early church was really to state that Caesar was God. And the Christians, the early Christians, of course, could not tolerate the very thought of such a blasphemous statement. Bear in mind that many of them, of course, came out of Judaism as well. And so there was a great fear on the one hand, and there was an abhorrence on the other of recognizing anyone but Jesus as Lord of Lords. It was interesting that later some of the church fathers said, listen, make the statement Caesar is Lord, because Jesus is the Lord of Lords. Well, by this time, the church had grown to such a significant size that this became a major problem for the emperor. So he ordered the first empire-wide persecution, the first serious attempt by a monarch to systematically destroy the very fabric of the church. For the first time, there was wide compliance by government officials with the emperor's decree. The appointed commissioners made strenuous efforts to ensure that every single citizen had obtained a libellus, or they were arrested and punished for sedition. Because of this, the numbers of the church fell away. It even included bishops. It produced a crisis within the church, and of course, having produced that kind of crisis, produced a joy to its enemies. And the crisis was heightened by bitter schisms that occurred within the church. Some reckon there was little harm, for the sake of national unity and peace for the church, in burning a pinch of incense. They refused to allow that they had been guilty of idolatry. They saw no reason why they should be punished by the sterner Christians. Others, when the persecution has run its course, fiercely opposed allowing those who had lapsed to come back to church. Some were willing to restore backsliders, but quarrelled about how they should be restored, what penalty, what sort of discipline should be exacted from them. Some of those divisions arose from arguments contained down through the centuries. Well, regardless of all of that, the fact is that Decius was killed only 2 years after his edict, and his successor Gallus was far too much occupied with other troubles to give much attention to fulfilling the Decian decrees. Thus, the severities of persecution abated, but it is an interesting thing, if Decius had lived, he may well have succeeded. But later history shows that the church was not immune from destruction. It's been obliged, as we will see, to hand over to other faiths, lands that were once wholly Christian. One of the victims of the Decian persecution, however, was Origen, who was among the greatest teachers of the early church. Here is his story, which begins in the year 212, when he was 17 years of age. He was the son of a wealthy Christian parents and was himself a devout and zealous young man. Persecution had broke out at the instigation of the emperor, Septimus Servius, and Origen's father, Leonidas, had been arrested. Eusebius gives this account. As the flame of persecution had been kindled greatly, and multitudes had gained the crown of martyrdom, such desire for martyrdom seized the soul of Origen, although yet a young boy, and he went close to danger, springing forward and rushing to the conflict in his eagerness. But God prevented his desire through the agency of his mother. For at first, entreating him, she begged him to have compassion on her motherly feelings towards him. But finding that when he'd learned that his father had been seized and imprisoned, He was more resolute and completely carried away with the idea of martyrdom. So she hid all of his clothing and thus compelled him to remain at home. But as there was nothing else he could do, in his zeal beyond his age would not suffer him to be quiet, he sent his father an encouraging letter of martyrdom, in which he exhorted him, saying, "Take heed not to change your mind on our account." Well, the young man apparently found the prospect of rushing naked through the streets far more daunting than the terrible death of the arena. So his wish for martyrdom was at that time denied. But from that position of considerable affluence, his family was reduced to abject poverty, and Origen had to resume the responsibility of caring for his mother and 6 younger brothers. This adversity, far from discourage him, inflamed his zeal all the more, and he laboured mightily. He studied and taught Greek philology, literature, copying manuscripts, and his efforts were rewarded. He eventually restored the family's prosperity. However, he continued to live very meagerly himself. Indeed, so great was his urge towards holiness, the desire to serve Christ alone while he was still a young man, he acted literally on Matthew 19:12, took a knife and castrated himself, an act of youthful folly that he later rather ruefully denounced. Eusebius mastered philosophy, theology, and other disciplines. He became one of the great Bible commentators and perhaps the first of the early teachers to produce a systematic statement of the major doctrines of Christianity. He remains the progenitor and model of every Bible college that has since been built. Origen himself provides a fine example of godliness, the discipline, the love of learning that should mark all who wish to be noble teachers of the word of God. At the end of 55 years of devoted service, the great man gained the prize he'd sought, a martyr's crown. During the Dacian persecution, Origen was arrested, put in chains, tortured, burdened with a crushing iron collar, and racked over a long period. Eusebius continues his sufferings. How many things he endured for the word of Christ: bonds and bodily tortures, torments under the iron collar and in the dungeon. For how many days, with his feet stretched 4 spaces in the stocks, he bore patiently the threats of fire and whatever other things were inflicted by his enemies, as his judge strove eagerly with all his might not to end his life. Throughout the agonies of prolonged and repeated torture, Origen remained steadfast in his faith. His tormentors could not break his spirit and finally released him, but his health was ruined and he soon died, shattered in body, but mighty in spirit. The torturous persecution of the Dacian period had terrible consequences on so many people. We cannot, we must not, we should not diminish the awfulness of what our forefathers went through to give us the faith we now appreciate. Well, the next set of persecutions began with a fellow called Valerian. The Valerian persecutions from 258 to 260 were a particularly terrible time for the early church. The persecution began by Decius was continued with varying severity for nearly 10 years by the new emperor Valerian. Like Decius, his policies and reasons were not motivated by hatred of the church or of Christians, but rather by a desire to strengthen the empire against his foes. When he inherited the empire, it was on the edge of ruin. Plague in many places, invaders penetrating the north and eastern boundaries. Within the empire was considerable civil strife, sedition, and it threatened to revolt. So, like his predecessor, Valerian resolved to secure heaven's favour by uniting the people in a common act of sacrifice, just the same as it had been with Decius, but with this very similar kind of results. The problem was that Christianity was continuing to grow. With a general policy of religious freedom, most people found no problem adding Rome to their cult, but the Christians, of course, found it impossible. By this time, the church had recovered from Decian's troubles and gained a much tougher temper. Most Christians refused to obey Valerian's edict, and so in 258 this patience snapped and he decided he was going to go after the church leaders. He would take the pastors, the bishops, the priests, the deacons. They would be executed, church properties confiscated, and public officials were to be enslaved. In 258, the Cyprian of Carthage was charged by the proconsul Galerius Maximus. You have lived a long and irreligious life, have drawn together a number of men bound by an unlawful association, and professed yourself an open enemy to the gods and religion of Rome. Therefore you have been apprehended as principal and ringleader of these infamous crimes. You shall be made an example to those whom you have wickedly associated with. The authority of the law shall be ratified in your blood. The devastation caused by Valerian was appalling. But once again, Providence, or God, intervened. Only 2 years after issuing his edict, Valerian was captured by the Persians in 260. Amazingly, this was the very first time a Roman emperor had been captured in battle, and it sent a shock of horror and shame. Many people saw it as the judgment of God upon a persecuting prince. The violence came to an end, and for 40 years the church had peace, suffering only sporadic and local harassment, generally enjoying peace in the nation. Well, then came the Diocletian persecution from 303 to 305. Amazingly short time, but still devastating in its consequences. Diocletian took over the empire, but began to realize very, very quickly that the empire itself was crumbling. So he had to find a way to build and restore the empire. To do this, encouraged by Galerius, they decided to persecute the Christians, much the same as his predecessor had done. So when the Christians resisted, Diocletian issued various edicts commanding the destruction or appropriation of churches. He designed to destroy the clergy, the lay leaders, and the churches. Eventually, when that failed, he determined upon complete extermination of Christianity. Eusebius, in his books 8 and 9 of his church history, provides a gripping account of the last battle in the warfare between Imperial Rome and the Church. Much of it was told in the life of Alban, the first British martyr. The man was a pagan, but being of a humane disposition, he sheltered an English ecclesiastic named Amphibulus, of whom some officers were in pursuit of on account of his religion. The example and discourses of the refugee made a great impression on Alban. He longed to become a member of the religious order that charged him, and Amphibulus was quite happy to instruct him and to bring him to Christ. Alban then helped Amphibulus to escape. He was arrested in his stead, carried to the Roman governor, and commanded to be sacrificed to the pagan deities. Alban declared that he would not comply and professed himself to be a Christian. The governor ordered him to be scourged, but he bore the punishment with great fortitude, and he seemed to acquire a new resolution from his sufferings, for which he was then beheaded. The thing is, too, that Diocletian suffered great sickness, and as a result of the sickness that he suffered, he chose to abdicate. It's interesting that the Roman emperors that have chosen to persecute the church ended in death or disease. Despite the violence and wide extent of this great imperial persecution, the church was saved from ruin for two reasons. The first, in various parts of the empire, the authorities were so displeased by these edicts and desultory in fulfilling them. The Christians were so numerous, with many of them wealthy and influential, and peace had endured for decades. Many officials thought it was stupid to tear the community apart by embarking on a religious war against their own people. And secondly, of course, Diocletian's health collapse, which led to abdication after only 2 years. On this matter, the historian and apologist Lectonicus wrote a memorable account of the violent deaths that one after the other struck down the persecuting emperors. The same idea, that the prayers of the Church finally prevailed over all its enemies, either to change them or to overthrow them, were presented by Origen. He said, "We do, when occasion requires, give help to kings, and that, so to say, a divine help, putting on the whole armour of God, and this we do in obedience to the injunction of the Apostle. I exhort, therefore, that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and the giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings, and for all in authority. And the more anyone excels in piety, the more effective does that help render that he brings to the kings. And the more effective help does he render, even more than that given by soldiers who go forth and slay as many of the enemy as they can. And as we by our prayers vanquish demons who store up war, lead to violation of oaths and the disturbance of peace, we in this way are much more helpful to the king and those who go to the field and fight for them. And none fight better for the king than we do, for we fight on his behalf, forming a special army, an army of piety, by offering our prayers to God." Now, that, of course, brings us finally to the end of persecution. The civil war had broken out and there were many problems in the empire. And finally, Constantine, after defeating all of his rivals, finally united the whole Roman Empire under his rule, and the days of suffering came to an end. Indeed, even before his power was fully consolidated, he joined Licinius in issuing a policy of full toleration of all religions. Thus was the Edict of Milan, which read in part, "Of all things that are beneficial to mankind, the worship of God must stand highest and be of our foremost concern. Therefore, it is right that Christians and all peoples be allowed freedom to observe whichever religious belief they choose. God, the God who rules in heaven, will then look upon us and upon all the peoples over whom we rule with favour. We therefore decree that all who choose the Christian religion may continue to live in its observance. Let no one prohibit or hinder them. Let no one molest or injure them. Furthermore, this decree applies to all religions. Every person is granted the right to practice their religion without interference. This agrees with the good order of the empire and will promote the present public well-being, that every person should be free to worship his God in his own way." Well, I'm aware that I'm very quickly now running out of time, so let us just take a moment now to consider our conclusion. For what we need to understand, why is it that Christianity, against all of the persecution, was able to survive? Well, Latourette dismisses all of the many reasons that were given in favour of this one. The more one examines the various factors which seem to account for the extraordinary victim of Christianity, which, by the way, had outlasted the persecutors, had outgrown it, and had established a system far greater than the Roman system itself, a system of administration. How was it? It is clear that from the very beginning of Christianity there must have occurred a vast release of energy, unequalled in the history of the race. Without it, the future course of the faith is inexplicable. That burst of energy was ascribed by the early disciples to the founder of their faith. Something happened to the men who associated with Jesus in his contact with them, in his crucifixion, and in their assurance of his resurrection, and of the continued living presence with his disciples of his Spirit, is to be found in the major cause of the success of Christianity. Without Jesus, Christianity would not has sprung into existence, and from him and beliefs about him came its main dynamic. And it's so important to grasp hold of that. You really have to get hold of the book, the world's greatest story, because it is the world's greatest story. And why is it important? It is important because you matter. You matter to God. You matter so much. And the very beginning of Christianity is found, of course, in this very statement that for God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And that is the very thing that the martyrs have shown us through their sacrifice, through their willingness to give their all. The question, of course, is, are you willing to sacrifice? Do you believe in Jesus so much that you too would sacrifice everything you have? Because, my friend, I fear that the days are coming when we are going to find out if we will have the fortitude of the early saints to withstand the persecution which is to come. And indeed, I hope you will. Well, I'm Pastor Dennis Plant. I'm with Vision Bible College, and you can find us on the internet, visionbiblecollege.edu.au, and I'd love to hear from you, to get in touch with you. So till next time, may the Lord bless you real good. And we're watching and we're listening to and about the two great periods of persecution.